And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. As many of you are aware, protesters disrupted a service on Sunday morning there in Minneapolis at City's Church. Don Lemon, other protesters came in, disrupted that service. I wanted to address that at the beginning of this episode. I thought about doing an entire episode, but actually, this isn't even a close call. And the law is very clear on this point. And so I think how to respond to this could be addressed pretty quickly. I just wanted to address that issue because it addresses churches, security, protections, public life, all of the above. So I wanted to address that quickly. But then I want to jump into 5 lessons from a great American, Frederick Douglass. And as we are thinking about America's 250th birthday, he is an American that I've studied a good bit as of late. I have drawn some lessons from his life. I wanted to pass those along. I want to do a few of these this year, just looking back at America's rich history and some great Christian citizens that have done some great things in our country. So back to the Minnesota disruption. Again, many of you probably have seen the video of Don Lemon interviewing the pastor there, Jonathan Parnell. And just very simply, a church sanctuary is not a sidewalk. All right, so a church is not a public forum. Just because it is open to all people for people to come in to worship, that does not mean you can just come in and do whatever you want. It is private religious property, and both states, in fact, I would think all states, I'm always reluctant to say all, but I believe in this case, all states would have a trespassing law. And so if a church looks at someone and says, hey, you're disrupting our service, you need to leave, that person refuses, that's trespassing. If you tell them, hey, I don't want you to come back next week, and they do, that can be trespassing. And it's something that the local prosecutor can actually prosecute. So certainly a church is not a public forum. And by opening the doors, you don't modify the church into a public forum. And so this church had every right to look at the protesters and say, hey, you're disrupting a sacred space, you're disrupting morning worship, and therefore you need to leave. Now, I found it especially disconcerting that Don Lemon was looking at this pastor and basically telling him that he's not properly practicing Christian love and doctrine while interfering with a worship service on Sunday morning. And I think writ large, the issue here is that as Americans, our politics become increasingly disruptive, increasingly violent. We need sacred spaces. We need to be able to go to a church on Sunday morning and worship and pray with our family without the crash of all of the vitriol in the streets coming into that sacred space. Now, certainly the church should speak to issues the world deems political, but from the authority of Scripture. And as I'm sure listeners go to their local church on a Sunday morning, you do so to find strength, to find respite from the chaos of the week. And as you read some of the reports from the church members, they used even the word violated. They feel like their own sacred space was interrupted by all that occurred. And so very simply, this was most likely trespassing, perhaps with the intent to come in, but certainly after the leadership said, hey, you don't need to be here, you need to leave, that would fall under trespassing. So it's not even really a close call here. Also, there is a federal law called the FACE Act, Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, and this prohibits the use of force, threats of force, or physical obstruction to interfere with anyone lawfully exercising or seeking to exercise the First Amendment right of religious freedom at a place of religious worship. Violations can result in fines and imprisonment with enhanced penalties for bodily injury. And it is good to see, in this case, we talk about the role of government to maintain order. This is a proper moment for the state to step in and say, hey, this is incorrect, this is wrong. And so I welcome the announcement that the DOJ is going to be investigating this. This type of behavior has to stop. And certainly if this was the invasion of a place of worship of another faith, let's say it was a mosque on Sunday, now, I imagine there would be a great furor if, let's say, the roles had been reversed. This was a conservative group of protesters going into a mosque or something. This is just a violation of a sacred space and needs to stop. So for churches responding to this, and I'm sure City's Church there has legal counsel. They're going to be looking at this. And the pastor did refuse to be kind of drawn into the situation, into making a statement. Largely other than, hey, we're trying to worship. Nobody actually wants to talk. And so please leave. Stop doing this. You're scaring our congregants and those with children. This is disruptive, and ask them to go. But many times, if this happens in a church, and certainly if this would occur at your church, if you have some individuals designated as a security team, this would be an argument for those security teams. But to have those individuals designated, and they could be the ones to confront, general wisdom is to let the pastor continue preaching, just keep going on. Now, with a protest of this size, that's very difficult. But if you have that security team to be able to kind of stop them at the entrances and say, what is your purpose here? But if people appear to be coming in to worship and then they turn around and protest, generally you have those ushers, those individuals from the security team that can come in and ask them to leave in a non-confrontational way. If they won't leave, then certainly calling the police and getting them involved in something like this is appropriate. Taking steps necessary to protect congregants and certainly those with small children. So again, I thought about maybe expanding that a little bit more, but this isn't even a close call. We need sacred spaces. Sacred spaces are not public forums, and having someone interrupt a public worship service while chiding a pastor for not properly exercising Christian love and doctrine. Oh boy, here we are in the United States in 2026. So just wanted to mention those notes. I'll drop a link in the show notes to a good article that really walks through a lot of these different legal categories, and I feel like we need to recreate that. But I did want to respond to this, that this is definitely a violation of a sacred space on a Sunday morning. Our laws respect that space, and I do hope that the administration, even the local officials there in Minnesota, would see that this is different in kind than this disagreement over immigration, which we addressed at length last week. If you are interested, I went into the ICE agents, the shooting there in Minneapolis, even the potential thoughts of what happens if ICE agents come into a church, kind of a different scenario from this. And so we've tried to address it all, but this is just a flagrant violation of a sacred space on a Sunday morning. With that said, I want to pivot over into 5 lessons from the life of Frederick Douglass, a remarkable American. He was, in a sense, a modern-day prophet. He looked to those biblical prophets, as we will discuss. He stirred the American conscience, decried the grave hypocrisy of the Christian church on the issue of slavery, challenged and encouraged President Abraham Lincoln to lead the United States to abolish the institution. I would consider him a founding father of the second founding, as some historians refer to it, those Civil War amendments, how we address slavery through the Civil War and then afterward. And so a remarkable story, a remarkable life. And so I wanted to dive into some of the lessons that I learned while studying his life. There's a great book called Prophet of Freedom. There are many different biographies of Frederick Douglass. If you're watching the video, I'll actually show a picture of the book by David Blight, won the Pulitzer Prize, and just a great retelling of his life. It's a long read, but goes into a lot of detail, including his spiritual life, his personal life. And so if you're really trying to understand what drove such a remarkable individual, a remarkable human being, it's a great way to dive in and learn. So I want to start with a very prominent truth that brought about throughout his writings, from really his first speeches all the way until the end, is that biblical Christianity is the cure, not the cause. And specifically speaking to slavery, but I would also mention this applies to other social ills as well. So often Christianity, because it's been so prevalent in our history, as part of our founding, our makeup as a country, that it's often decried for many social ills. But there's a specific word here, biblical Christianity. All right, biblical Christianity. Biblical Christianity is the cure, not the cause. And so I'm going to kind of go through his life throughout these five lessons that I've learned. So Frederick Douglass, 1817 or circa 1817 to 1895, he did not know when he was born, and so it was hard to assess his date of birth, his age. Because of that, and this is a mark of his being born into slavery. He was born on one of the wealthiest slave plantations in Maryland, and very early on, he was an observer of some of the brutality that was evident in American slavery. He observed the brutal whipping of his 15-year-old Aunt Hester while still a very young boy. In 1826, his owner sent him to Baltimore to live with a couple named Hugh and Sophia Alden. This is a remarkable turn of providence, and the author in Prophet of Freedom goes into some detail. At this time, cotton is booming. Owning slaves was a very lucrative thing, and it is remarkable that he was not sold into the deep South. And so this very clearly is God's providence working in his life. There with Hugh and Sophia, Hugh said that reading would ruin Frederick as a slave, but Sophia, the wife, taught Douglas the alphabet. And again, this is against all statistical odds. Why would a master, in a sense, in that time, one, send him up to Maryland rather than to the deep South, and then to teach him the alphabet, to teach him to read? Why was that not the case normally? Because exactly of what Hugh said, we don't want to recognize the equal dignity of these individuals, and letting them read could destroy this whole institution called slavery. And so once Hugh discovered it, he stopped Sophia's illegal instruction, but Frederick covertly continued his studies and taught himself how to read and write. There's a really remarkable part of this part of the story, in the sense that during this time, Frederick would be able to run around a bit. He was able to build friendships with other boys, and he would speak later of the boys of Philpott Street. And these were essentially kind of street kids, or some kids from the neighborhood, probably not super wealthy. And like any kids, they would just be out playing games in the street. And he would have conversations with them. And the boys of Philpott Street are significant because they would say to him that they did not believe God made anyone to be a slave. And so from the mouth of children, and so Frederick Douglass would speak later on about natural law, and how as human beings we were born with equal dignity as individuals made in the image of God, and that it actually took the social conditioning of the American South, of the American culture at that time, to make people believe that, in fact, that African American slaves were less than and could be enslaved. And so he would speak often of the boys of Philpott Street. I've actually noted this. I want to use this in some of our talks and maybe sermons as well. Here are these just boys running around. They saw the image of God in him. During this period, Douglass came to Christ under the teaching of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. So at first, he heard some sermons. One was by just a Methodist preacher, and this would have actually been a white Methodist preacher who would get up, and he did preach the gospel, saying that all, bond and free, must repent, that we've all sinned and come short of God's glory. And he said that we should love all. Frederick Douglass, as he came to Christ, was convicted and just blessed by the fact that God had forgiven him. And this argued for him to forgive even those that were holding him as a slave. And his great desire was to see the world converted. During this period of time, he also was under the tutelage or discipleship of not just black pastors, but also a particular layman who really discipled him, poured into him. And this was an encouragement to me. Like, as ministers, we never know who we're ministering to, and we don't know what that story is going to be. And so he poured into him. And so Frederick Douglass also really enjoyed the writings of the Apostle Paul, someone who also ended up in chains, right? And he enjoyed Romans. And so speaking to the natural law once again, and God's creation order, that surely no human being is of less worth than another just because of the color of their skin. And so he really would lean into Paul's writings in the future. As Frederick Douglass would write later, he said, "The silver trump of freedom had aroused my soul to eternal wakefulness. Freedom now appeared to disappear no more forever." And as you're going to hear in his writings, of course, Frederick Douglass is known for his just amazing language and writing, his ability to turn a phrase and to touch the conscience. Douglass escaped north to Massachusetts in 1833. Now, again, if he had been sold into the Deep South, what are the possibilities of this happening? So again, you think about the strings of providence in this story already, that he's born, instead of being sold into the Deep South, he goes north, and then just so happens that this mother, wife teaches him the alphabet before the husband finds out and stops it, and this gifting is awakened in him, and he used to use it for the rest of his life. By 1841, so he escapes north into Massachusetts in 1833, and there's a growing abolitionist movement at this point, and so he just jumps right in. I mean, what a story. You're an escaped slave, you're literate, you can write, you can speak, you can turn a phrase. By 1841, he was speaking on the anti-slavery circuit around the nation, and by 1845, he had published his first autobiography, Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave. Now, if you've read the book, The Good Citizen, I talk a good bit about a similar story in England called Equano. He wrote a similar autobiography that captured the hearts and minds of the public. Frederick's story became an instant sensation, selling 30,000 copies in just 5 years. And so the American public, especially those in the North, they knew this was wrong. All right, this is one of the reasons why I think this story is so popular. It is just his autobiography of here's how I was an enslaved human being, and now he writes it. There's a great line that he would speak of around this time. And what he was doing is, as an American prophet, in a sense, a prophet of freedom, as David Blight frames it, he would just point out this very simple hypocrisy. And he said, if I go to Lexington or Bunker Hill, there I'm a slave, chained in perpetual servitude, because, of course, he had not actually been released from slavery. He had just escaped. So if I go to Lexington or Bunker Hill, there I'm a slave, chained in perpetual servitude. I may go to your deepest valley, to your highest mountain. I'm still a slave, and the bloodhound may chase me down. Speaking of the fact that during this time, there laws were developed where slave masters could track slaves into the North, the fugitive slave laws, and take them back. And so he's pointing out, these very symbols of American freedom, of American liberty. I could stand there and still be a slave. So pointing out the hypocrisy there. Douglass' speeches and books specifically railed against the hypocrisy and evils of slavery in the United States. He declared, between the Christianity of this land and the Christianity of Christ, I recognize the widest possible difference. And he reserved his strongest words for pastors in the South, stating, the man who wields the blood-clotted cowskin during the week fills the pulpit on Sunday and claims to be a minister of the meek and lowly Jesus. Frederick also traveled to and spoke in Ireland and Great Britain. And he gave one of his greatest speeches, the London reception speech, during this tour. He referenced, look, those in the American South, they could not serve God and mammon, and they blasphemed in claiming they adhered to the teachings of the meek and lowly Jesus. He would refer to them as man-stealers and cradle plunderers because, obviously, families would be split up. He strongly used the idea of the Old Testament prophet, the writings of Isaiah and of Jeremiah. At one point, he actually read much of a chapter from the book of Isaiah in one of his speeches, referring to the evils and calling out to the leaders, just like that Old Testament prophet. I always enjoy when different historical strands kind of come together in the same story. And Frederick Douglass actually met Thomas Clarkson, who was one of the English abolitionists. If you read the story of the Clapham sect, William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson is going to be in there as well. So it fascinates me that those two individuals actually met, Frederick Douglass and Thomas Clarkson. So I mentioned this, that Frederick Douglass's point, as he was preaching, in a sense, as he's giving these orations, was that biblical Christianity, the true biblical Christianity, was not the cause of this. Rather, it was the cure. And this is an important point, certainly in our society today, where everyone wants to claim, hey, Christianity is the issue. We need to get rid of this religion. We need to move on from it. When actually Frederick Douglass was saying, look, you haven't practiced it like it's written in the book. And so you need to go back to the book, in a sense. So another thing that he would talk about often is even patriotism. And so he would say, look, here's American Christianity, and then here's biblical Christianity as practiced. And so kind of American Christianity in the sense of what was done in the South, and then here's biblical Christianity. And he would then talk about this idea of citizenship. So this gets right to the heart of the Good Citizen podcast, of what we're trying to do. And he would point out, he said, here's patriotism. Patriotism means the best friend of a nation is he who most faithfully rebukes her for sins, and he her worst enemy who under the specious garb of patriotism seeks to excuse, palliate, or defend them. So he was saying, look, a patriot, someone that loves their country, will also point out sins. He has a famous a famous speech called "What to the Slave is the 4th of July." I wanted to read a little bit of that because he kind of continues along this theme of he is a faithful citizen. He wants to make a difference. He's not throwing away the American experiment, but he is going to call out hypocrisy. So just a little bit of the speech. If you've never read it in full, I encourage you to do that. What to the American slave is your 4th of July? I answer, a day that reveals to him more than all other days in the year the gross injustice and cruelty to which he is the constant victim. To him, your celebration is a sham, your boasted liberty an unholy license, your national greatness swelling vanity. Your sounds of rejoicing are empty and heartless, your denunciation of tyrants, brass-fronted impudence, your shouts of liberty and equality, hollow mockery, your prayers and hymns, your sermons and thanksgiving, with all your religious parade and solemnity, are to him mere bombast, fraud, deception, impiety, and hypocrisy, a thin veil to cover up crimes which would disgrace a nation of savages. There is not a nation on the earth guilty of practice more shocking and bloody than are the people of the United States at this very hour. So if you can imagine, given to a largely white audience on a 4th of July occasion, how this might have hit folks. But in all of this, and so in a sense, he is taking up this prophetic role. Those are hard things to hear, but aren't they true? If we say all people, all men are created equal, we kind of left out a certain number of folks in that, right? And so you would think that as an escaped slave, someone that has every right to be angry with the United States and to call out its hypocrisy, you think he might just say, burn it all down. But that's not what he says. And so you listen to that first part of the speech, you think, okay, he's going towards just completely deriding the United States. Let's be done with this. But he continues, allow me to say in conclusion, notwithstanding the dark picture I have this day presented of the state of the nation, I do not despair of this country. There are forces in operation which must inevitably work the downfall of slavery. The arm of the Lord is not shortened, and the doom of slavery is certain. I therefore leave off where I began with hope, while drawing encouragement from the Declaration of Independence, the great principles it contains, and the genius of American institution. My spirit is also cheered by the obvious tendencies of the age. And so here we see Frederick Douglass coming at this grave institution of slavery, but saying, look, it is biblical Christianity that is the cure. It is not the cause of this. And as he began to see the abolitionist movement rise, largely and often driven by Christian principles, he was cheered by that as he moved forward. So that was the first lesson I took, and something that we certainly need to push today. Biblical Christianity is not the cause of this. No, it's actually the cure if you'll practice it properly. The second lesson that I took away from his life is the importance of the role of prophet, or that the role of the prophet in public life is important. Frederick Douglass described, he says, the whole of his politics could be wrapped up in this line. Righteousness exalts a nation. Sin is a reproach to any people. And that constitutes the whole of my politics, is his phrase or his quote. Now, as you can imagine, here he is, he's working to address the issue of slavery. And then the Supreme Court came down with this terrible, dreadful, to maybe put a pun in there a little bit, decision, the Dred Scott case, which essentially held that slaves were property. They didn't have rights, in a sense. And so if you could imagine, how do you respond to this? If this is your calling, this is the topic that you are convicted by, and you're trying to convict others around, and then the Supreme Court just says, nope, individual's not a person under the Constitution. And so he came at this saying that the Supreme Court of the United States is not the only power in the world, but the king. He is King Jesus. He is the ultimate power in the world. And so in a moment where this could have embittered him, this could have made him go down a path maybe of just giving up. Like at any time, he's a famous guy, could have just maybe retired from all of this and just enjoyed the fact that he himself had escaped slavery. But no, he turns to eternal justice, to his eternal king, to say, one day this will be made right. You also find in the abolitionist movement differences of opinion on how to make this change. And so I find this helpful because in anything, let's say the life issue or parental rights, there are always differing approaches, and people hold them very strongly. So this was not news to Frederick Douglass. Garrison, one of the famous writers, early on, kind of a mentor to Frederick Douglass, someone that gave him opportunity. They ultimately had a falling out. Garrison's approach was much less political. He wanted it to be culturally driven, church-driven. And then, of course, you have John Brown, who literally took up arms against the federal government. There's at least one famous song about John Brown and John Brown's body and all that. And so Douglass kind of was in the middle of that and saying, no, there does need to be action through the ballot. There does need to be action in politics. And he's one of these early figures. We talk about the 1619 Project, which many people have not even really thought of until recently. 1619 is when a Dutch galley slave ship brought slaves to the New World for the first time from these European powers. And then, of course, he would juxtapose 1619 with 1620, the Mayflower. And he would talk about how these were two different visions of what America was to be. And, of course, the 1620 lesson, the 1620 expression of liberty and the Mayflower Compact and all of that, that was the genius of America. And that was the view of America's future that should prevail. And so I found that helpful, even relevant today. Who knew that even today we'd be talking about, which way America, 1619 in the sense of just adopting humanist principles, whatever is economically feasible, whatever is kind of a majority consideration there, versus actually coming to plant, respect God, respect biblical principles. So as all these things roll forward, of course, John Brown's body, his issue there at Harper's Ferry, standing up to the federal government and being killed. Then we have the outbreak of the Civil War. And here's Frederick Douglass, saying, look, here's this open revolt, perhaps the greatest opportunity in his lifetime, in a sense, to end slavery. Now, he certainly didn't welcome the bloodshed there. There were times later on where he would say, hey, this is necessary, that there's this great evil. And even Lincoln, in his second inaugural address, would refer to the Civil War in a sense of a theodicy, saying that this actually was judgment on the United States for the issue of slavery, the sin of slavery. And so Douglass kind of picks up that same idea as well, saying that this is necessary, that the bloodshed is awful, the graves are awful, but it's a necessary conflict over an important principle. But of course, Lincoln at first, as you study his life, he did not want to focus on the issue of slavery because he thought it would break the political coalition. And so Lincoln and timing, there's a good passage in the book about this. He specifically would say in a silent meeting or in a private meeting, that he did not want to start the war to end slavery, that would break down the coalition. And he said about slavery that this thunderbolt will wait. Now, of course, all of that changes with the Emancipation Proclamation, where the political calculus did change. Not enough. I mean, this was still a major step for President Lincoln to take that. It certainly was not assured that he would win a second term. And in 1864, you talk about where the American Republic was on the line. Maybe Gettysburg in a military sense, but that 1864 election where Lincoln barely won, he brought on Johnson, his running mate, who was governor of Tennessee and pro-slavery, but brings him on to hopefully hold the Union together, and they barely survive that. There's some great places in the book are just talking about meetings in between Lincoln and Douglass. And one of them talks about how other people kept coming in, and Lincoln kept kind of shooing them out, saying, I want to be able to speak to him. And so they had an inaugural meeting, and Douglass talked to Lincoln about, hey, this needs to be the point of the war. You need to end slavery. This is the righteous cause. So here he is, the prophet, speaking not just to the nation, but to the president himself. And as you study Lincoln's life, you know how much he wrestled with this question. But Douglass visited Lincoln twice more, so there's an inaugural meeting twice more, and then he was invited to the second inaugural address. And so this is such an ominous moment. And I just love these kind of snapshots of history. Like, could I have been there to see this? And so Lincoln is there going up to give his second inaugural address. And he's standing there, he's standing next to Vice President Johnson. And of course, Vice President Johnson, pro-slavery, is going to have a terrible effect after the Civil War, on Reconstruction, on so many of the things that Douglas had presented and promoted throughout his life, going backwards. And so it said that Lincoln noticed Douglas and even pointed him out to Vice President Johnson. But it's this part of the book that's talking about this, that what was recounted later is that Johnson kind of initially looked at Douglas and kind of frowned at him, and then it developed in kind of a bland and sickly smile, is how it was described later. And so you get a little snapshot right here in the second inaugural. Lincoln's just getting up. He points out Douglas to his vice president. The vice president, of course, you've met people before that don't like you, I'm sure, and how they respond to you emotionally. And so he gives him this like frown and then a bland and sickly smile, ominous for sure. But then here's Frederick Douglass. Can you imagine? He's in the audience for the second inaugural address. And so can you imagine him listening as President Lincoln says, "Fondly do we hope, fervently do we pray, that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away. Yet if God wills that if it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." What a moment. And Douglas told the president later that it was just a triumphal moment. It was a beautiful moment. So if you can imagine Douglas, who's been saying this his whole life, to have President Lincoln affirm that in his second inaugural address. And unfortunately, one of the great what-ifs of history, right there, what if Lincoln had not been assassinated? And he had been able to work with Douglas to rebuild the South, rather than Reconstruction and carpetbagging and the snap back into Jim Crow and all of these rights promised around the time of the Civil War, taking more than 100 years. You think about 1964 to actually come into place. The what-ifs of history, it's so hard to read that and think about what might have happened. But of course, Lincoln was assassinated. So that second lesson is that the role of prophet is important. Here is Frederick Douglass, wasn't the president himself, but he consistently had this message. President Lincoln, this is a righteous cause. This is why we're fighting. And you even see that influence, perhaps. We don't know exactly why Lincoln wrote those, but you see some of those themes in the second inaugural address. So that's our role as Christians, to be the conscience to our society and to do so over time. The third lesson that I would say is to ground reform in creation order, not government. And I am going to speed up just a little bit here. As Douglas moves forward, all right, he's going to see the Civil War amendments passed, all right, and this is going to be the great triumph of his life. But then he begins to see some of these things eroded over time, and so he's always coming back to, why does this matter? And so he pleaded with Americans to build a better society on the broad foundation laid by the Bible itself, that God has made of one blood all nations of men to dwell on the face of the earth. He was a supporter of women's suffrage, but he was so focused on making sure that those that had been released as slaves, these new freedmen and women, that they would have the right to vote. Certainly the freedmen would have the right to vote. And he, in a sense, kind of asked the women's suffrage movement to wait their turn. That was not well received by Stanton and others. He also, every person has feet of clay. He also said that Indians had not attained the position of civilized man like the black man had at that point. And so everybody has kind of a blind side oftentimes in history. And so that is one that is mentioned by historians. Now, throughout this, he always rooted his reforms in creation order, not government. Throughout all of the negative Supreme Court cases, throughout all of the setbacks, he always just comes back to that simple belief that we're made in the image of God. And there's some beautiful moments, even personally. So can you imagine? He goes back to meet Thomas Auld. So this is his slave master. Who owned him in a sense, back when he was younger. He goes to see him as Thomas Auld is dying. He's older now, and he talks about how the slave and the master were reduced to the same level. And he talked about how even the constancy of hate breaks down before the brightness of infinite light. So as Thomas was looking at eternity, they had a moment to connect. And this was, I think, helpful to Frederick as he was able to, in a sense, maybe kind of close that chapter, to be able to say, here's this person that literally enslaved me. Now he goes to meet his maker, and they had a chance to connect before he went. So can you imagine being a fly on the wall when that happened? Also, Joseph Talbot, the sheriff that had locked him up previously as a slave, he actually came to one of Frederick Douglass's lectures. So here he is, again, he's after the Civil War, he's traveling, he's lecturing, and he's meeting the individual that held him as a slave and the individual that locked him up. And he's able to talk with these folks. Later on in his life, Frederick Douglass would remarry to a white woman named Helen Douglas Pitts. And of course, interracial marriage at this time, it was a big social taboo. And he just went at the press. He says, look, God Almighty made but one race. You may say that Frederick Douglass considers himself a member of the one race that exists. I love that. God Almighty made but one race. You may say that Frederick Douglass considers himself a member of the one race that exists. And so his lesson to me here is he's always coming back to creation order. He's always grounding reform, not on the Supreme Court, not on government, but on creation order. The fourth lesson that I learned from his life is to expect setbacks and snapbacks. And I mentioned the great what if of history. How would the story of Reconstruction, discrimination, and Jim Crow be different if Lincoln had lived and partnered with Douglass to create the just and lasting peace that Lincoln so eloquently explained? So unfortunately, we don't know that. Lincoln lived long enough to see the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, a Union victory in the Civil War, but his life was cut short by an assassin's bullet. He was replaced by Andrew Johnson, a former slave owner, former governor of Tennessee. Slavery ended, but its ghost remained. Because of this, you have Jim Crow laws. You have a series of just terrible court decisions that basically gutted much of those Civil War amendments. And he would speak of some of these decisions, like Plessy versus Ferguson, others involving train cars, etc. He would talk about how the Supreme Court had just gone backwards, and how basically they were allowing a conductor on a train car to have more power than the federal government. So the case is Slaughterhouse, Cruikshank, Plessy, if you want to go study them. And he would ask in 1876, do you mean to make good on the promises in your Constitution? He would say that they were desecrating the graves of our mothers, the sacred temples of worship. He called these cases a moral cyclone. He said that a Mississippi Railroad conductor had more power than the national government, and a hotel keeper with prejudice born of rebellion had the authority to expel black men as wished. If you've never read the book The Great Dissenter about Justice Harlan, who was the lone dissenter in Plessy, he said that the Constitution is colorblind and neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. And so through this, I mean, if you can imagine, I can't imagine actually, it would be like, as Christians, we fought so hard on the life issue, and then to see the Dobbs case overturned and to have, in a sense, kind of a national return to abortion. Now, in a sense, we've never been able to take this step of having protection for the life of all unborn. And maybe the best analogy is if we had a case that said that across the country, babies in the womb are protected, and then to have it snap back where some states can say no and some states can defend. This is kind of where Douglass found himself, where these amendments were meant to protect the rights of freed slaves in employment, to be able to vote, those sorts of things, to have the equal protections. And yet these were gutted by these Supreme Court decisions. And throughout much of this story, the individuals that are in authority in many of these places are former Confederates. And so can you imagine the sense of victory and triumph, and President Lincoln's there, and then he's assassinated, and then you see these setbacks and these snapbacks, and he talks about the invisible chain of slavery, that it had still not left. The battle and the blood that all this had happened in the Civil War, that it had not destroyed that invisible chain, and everything kept snapping back. And so for us, as we struggle to promote biblical principles in public life, there are so many things that we take 2 steps forward, we take a step back. And yet this didn't stop Frederick Douglass from promoting what is good and true, promoting the creation order related to the image of God. And so he had to expect setbacks and snapbacks. We should as well. Last thing I'll mention is he's a great example of hoping and working until the end. And this is one that I really wanted to emphasize for us as we celebrate the 250th anniversary of our country. In the Columbia exhibition, as he's getting older, he would say that he would get up, and he was always prophetic, all right? He was always just telling people what he thought. The problem is whether the American people have honesty enough, loyalty enough, patriotism enough to live up to their Constitution. And so until the very end, and this is what I so appreciate about him, he had every reason to give up on the American experiment from the very beginning, since he escaped as a slave in 1833. But all the way from then until his death in 1895, he was committed to the American Constitution, to the American experiment. You can see it there. Are the American people honest enough, loyal enough, patriotic enough to live up to their Constitution? And towards the end, he would say, as things are, we can only labor and wait in the belief that God reigns in eternity and all things work together for good. What an encouragement that he didn't see it. He didn't live to see the world that he envisioned, the society that he envisioned, where former slaves like him were welcomed as full American citizens and didn't have to sit in a separate car on a railroad and didn't have to go to a segregated school, that they would enjoy these equal protections under the law. He didn't live to see that. And yet he left it to God, just as he had back when you had the Dred Scott case. He would always think of there is an eternal judge that will one day set all of these things right. And he basically said as long as he had his pen and his voice, he was going to keep advocating. Eventually, of course, that pen and voice fell silent. And there's a beautiful poem about Douglass. It says, "Then Douglass passed, his massive form still quivering at unrightful wrong, his soul aflame, and on his lips a tale and prophecy of waiting work." I'll read that again. "Then Douglass passed, his massive form still quivering at unrightful wrong, his soul aflame, and on his lips a tale and prophecy of waiting work." Meaning that it wasn't done. And truly the work of the American experiment, this dedication to the idea that we are all created equal, and that if we follow God's good design, it will bring flourishing. As the founders would say, that every man would sit under his own vine and fig tree, and no one would make him afraid. That's the promise of the founding, the American experiment. Frederick Douglass is one of these individuals who saw where the American experiment had fallen short of that beautiful principle, but he didn't dispense with the experiment. He called the American experiment and our leaders, including some of our greatest leaders like Abraham Lincoln, to the fullness of that idea. And you can see his influence even in Lincoln. And so as that poem says, it's a tale and a prophecy of waiting work. We certainly have work to do. So those lessons in review: biblical Christianity is the cure, not the cause. Number two, the role of the prophet is important. That's our role as conscience of the nation. We should ground our reforms in creation, order, not government. We should expect setbacks and snapbacks of people falling back into these old things like the invisible chain of slavery, as he would say. And then we should hope and we should work until the end. So I was so encouraged by this incredible life, the life of Frederick Douglass, and I wanted to pass those on to you. May we be about the work of the American experiment, this prophecy, in a sense, this uncompleted or waiting work that we have to do to fully live out as a country the beautiful principle that we are founded on. We'll talk with you next week.